I'm just back from Brussels. I don't know what time it is. I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation, and today should be a really, really fun session. We're very happy to be here with Book TV today that is filming today's event. I also want to strongly encourage all of you to go visit our friendly representative of Politics and Prose, who has brought with her a whole passel of a brand new book called The Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order by my colleague here, Parag Khanna. A few weeks ago, if you didn't see it, the Reader's Digest version appeared as a cover story in the New York Times Magazine called Waving Goodbye to Hegemony. I think it was just brilliantly done. It was a very, very rich piece, but it has since sort of sparked all sorts of debates, not just about how Parag Khanna told his stories, which are richly told and filled with lots of empirical material that derive from trips that he's taken all over the world. I know because I rarely saw Parag over the last year and a half as we were colleagues, because he was always off in some exotic village somewhere, tough to reach, but always on his BlackBerry. Somehow or another, you made that work. And it has started off a debate. I just literally have returned from the Brussels Forum, sponsored by the German Marshall Fund, over in Europe. And this was one of these great meetings where everyone there was affiliated to some major publication or academic institution or some big bureaucracy in the foreign affairs or defense world in some country or region somewhere. And Parag Khanna's book was one of the few books that were being talked about during cocktail chatter. Whether he was right or wrong, what I thought of his prescriptions at the end of his piece in his book, etc. So if nothing else, and I think it is far more than this, Parag has sparked an interesting debate that to some degree lots of folks have already wanted to have, which is to what degree American power, as we knew it, is fundamentally going major change, and we need to rethink what the contours of those realities are. Parag Khanna is Senior Research Fellow and the Director of the Global Governance Initiative here at New America Foundation's American Strategy Program. He is this past summer, he was a senior geopolitical advisor to the U.S. Special Operations Forces in Iraq and Afghanistan. I don't even know why I mentioned that, since what he did was classified and he's not allowed to talk about it. So nonetheless, I know he did it. And previously, he was a fellow at the Brookings Institution and was one of the really prominent bright lights helping to move forward all sorts of interesting intellectual interactions at the World Economic Forum, where I first got to know Parag. So without further ado, let me invite Parag Khanna to share some ideas, and I will be back to moderate the meeting. So, Parag Khanna.
Thanks so much, Steve. Thanks to everyone for being here. Steve mentioned the book, The Second World, really does and is devoted to capturing my travels of the past few years, but of course it's not a travel narrative. It has that big picture message that Steve mentioned people in Brussels are talking about. The other B capital from which I've been getting a lot of feedback is Beijing, and I'm grateful for that, because fundamentally the geopolitical message that I wanted this book to send was that Beijing, Brussels, and Washington are the three global capitals where the important decisions in geopolitics and global governance are being made. They represent not necessarily unitary, imperial, competitive forces in the sense of 19th century European geopolitics, but they do represent imperial systems that have become worlds unto themselves, that have their own norms, standards, processes, and relations, and styles, which are competing to influence the world. And that fundamentally is what this book is about. But the story is told not through the eyes of Washington, Brussels, or Beijing, but through the eyes of what I call the Second World, which is anywhere from 40 to 50 countries. That's about the number that I did my research in the past few years, and how they see this evolving imperial dynamic. But it's also not just about us. It's not just about Europe, and it's not just about China. Those are the three places where I tried to spend the least time. It's about the countries themselves, how they're affected by geopolitics, how they're affected by globalization, what they want from the world, and what we need to know about them. It's very easy to stay in Washington and write a book about how we see the world, what we're doing, how we promote democracy, how we stand for free trade, how we are the force for good in the world, how we give such tremendous amount of development assistance, and all of those things. It's a completely different picture to go to the countries where all of this is playing out, and where you can't answer the question of what's America's role here simply by looking at America. You have to look at how we compete with Europe and how we compete with China. And that is the sort of meta lesson that I came away with from traveling to countries in Eastern Europe, in Central Asia, in Latin America, across the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia, which are the 5 regions or sections that make up the body of this book. Now, what is it that is different about the so-called Big Three? In my characterization, America pursues a coalitional style of diplomacy, sort of as in coalition of the willing. It's a term we're all obviously familiar with. Europe, on the other hand, has a consensus-oriented diplomacy, where everything is done in this sort of big tent kind of manner, and in which countries are bound to Europe on more than just one level, such as military level, political level, or trade economic level, but all of them at once. China's style of diplomacy is what I call consultative, which is something that reflects Asian traditions of diplomacy and interaction, where controversial issues are put off to the side and the focus is put on areas of common interest, and things are done in a sort of give and take manner, attempting to find a certain common ground. So those are the 3 C's of diplomacy that characterize the 3 superpowers: coalition, consultative, and consensus. Now, let me take one step back for a minute. Why am I talking about Europe and China and the United States? What about Russia? What about India? What about Islam? What about Brazil? What about all of those other powers? Any given day, you can open the newspaper and someone is writing an op-ed that says, the future will have 7 superpowers. No, we'll have 5. Or we'll have 3 and then a sub-tier. Or, of course, it'll just be America with a plethora of other potential regional aspiring rivals around the world. Why just 3? And I want to get this out of the way right now. The reason it's just 3 is because these are really the only 3 that have global influence. You don't hear about Russia anymore when you're in South Africa or Chile or Argentina and in other parts of the Antipodes. You do hear about China, though, and you do hear about Europe. These are the 3 powers that today, and because this is a book about sort of looking long term, these are the 3 powers that are growing in power, that are expanding their reach, and that have a global model that they're seeking to spread. Islam does not have that coherence. Russia no longer has that power or capacity or even necessarily ambition. Japan no longer does either. India isn't there yet, and on it goes. But the organizing principle for me are these Big Three, because that is what they are trying to do. And again, my travels through the Second World really show that is what their ambitions are and how they're competing in subtle ways. What I want to quickly do is go through region by region and explain just very briefly what it is that I saw. There are a lot of countries covered in the book, and I can only give a very, very brief encapsulation of how I made my observations and sort of what the conclusion was. But let me just focus on a couple of examples. Ukraine, Turkey, and Azerbaijan were the 3 countries that I focused on the most when looking at what I called Europe's East. Now, these are countries, with the exception of Turkey, and this is a region that was either part of the Soviet Union or part of the Warsaw Pact. Now, each and every one of these countries, again, Turkey, of course, always did, but has ever stronger relations with the West through the European Union or NATO, and many of them are becoming EU members or NATO members. This process of painting these countries from red to blue is what that section is about. How does it happen? How does Europe do it? Why do these countries want it so badly? What is it that Europe is offering them that we can learn from? Turkey provides the best example of this, because we believed, that Turkey was a stalwart American ally, a member of NATO for decades, and so on and so on. And then 2003, the Iraq War happened, and of course, the Bush administration learned that Turkey was not willing to support the invasion of Iraq the way that the U.S. had expected, and that the pressure, the internal pressures against it, and also something that was less noticed here, the pressure from Brussels not to comply with that, was very strong. And ultimately, of course, it hurt the U.S. effort to not have that support from Turkey. But for decades, Turkey has been growing ever nearer to Europe, economically, demographically, politically, and so on, and attempting to meet the criteria necessary for membership in the EU. My argument is that even if Turkey never becomes a full-fledged member of the European Union, it's already been in the process of becoming one and doing the things that Europe demands to become European anyways. That is what's more important than the seal that's put on it. If we were to have understood that better, we would have seen the extent to which Turkey relies on European investment, how much greater membership and political interaction and so forth means to Turkey, what a gigantic share of investment in Turkey comes from Europe, how much, meaning almost 100% of the remittances that go to Turkey come from Western Europe, and so on. Those things would have explained a lot, and if we were attuned to those internal dynamics, we would have had a better sense of what governs Turkey's decision-making. I use that one example to illustrate a much broader point. This book is written from the inside out of these countries. The goal is not to tell us Americans what we should do differently in each and every case or how we need to look at the world. There's plenty of debates about that. This is a book about how to understand these countries from the inside out, so that you can learn to think like them, so that we can make better decisions when we need to change our policies. So that's just one sample of what I get into with Eastern Europe. Then I focus on Central Asia, the stands. Every country that ends in stan is folded into that chapter, including Afghanistan and Pakistan. There's a reason, cartographic, historical, geopolitical reason why I include Afghanistan and Pakistan in Central Asia rather than the traditional category that they fall into in South Asia, which is where they still do from the State Department's point of view, but not from the Pentagon's point of view. And that's a debate I explain in the chapter. But the stands, these landlocked, oil-rich countries that many people can't spell, though we can probably find them on the map, why is it and how is it that China's influence has grown so rapidly in that area? And the answer actually has a lot to do with Tibet today, where we see protests, an area that's grabbing a lot of headlines. Beginning at the end of the Chinese Civil War is when China's westward expansion really began. And the location of Tibet and Xinjiang, which is the home of the Uyghur population north of Tibet, it's the largest province in China actually, is the story of where China's westward expansion towards the Central Asian stands began. And to understand today what's happening in Tibet and Xinjiang with the repression of the Tibetans and Uyghurs and the sort of expansion of the Chinese empire, viewing that story tells us a lot about how strong China is and how important it is for China to have those trade relations with the stands as a land and trade corridor through Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan to the Caspian Sea and to Iran, ultimately to the Persian Gulf. If you understand that bigger picture of what China's ambitions are, it tells you a lot about what is happening geopolitically in the decision-making of each of these stands, how it is that they decide where pipelines are going to go, at what price, and so on. And the way I frame the overall sort of a message or debate is about whether Central Asia will return to its past as a Silk Road, open borders, trade across cultures, mutual understanding, mutual benefit, or whether it will be like the 19th century Great Game between Britain and Russia over control of Central Asia, when the competition for it wasn't even about oil. Today, of course, it is. So the stakes are very, very high in this region, and I focus a lot in this chapter on Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan in particular. Then the third section is about Latin America, particularly Venezuela, Colombia, and Brazil. And I look at how it is that the notion of the Monroe Doctrine has more or less faded, been eroded over the last decades. And it isn't just Hugo Chavez and it isn't just sort of the notion that China is coming in and attempting to undermine American influence there. The fundamental story that almost unites the two is globalization. It's the notion that Latin America's vast and important natural resources can be shipped or sold and reached around the world far more efficiently than ever before. And that is the story of how Latin America is being put back on the geopolitical map. I actually had to almost fight with my editors to keep that chapter in the book, because Latin America is such an afterthought in American foreign policy thinking. And yet today, when you think really long term, I almost think Latin America is the salvation for America's geopolitical woes, because if and when relations with Venezuela are improved, and given all of the mutual investment in joint projects on energy security with Brazil because of their soy production, and also the fact that Brazil may indeed have as much oil and gas as Venezuela, you have a situation where, in fact, the Western Hemisphere could be energy self-sufficient and provide all the resources that America needs. Secondly, you have an economic situation where Latin American manufacturing, if stimulated again by the United States as it was in the 1950s, 1960s, could play a really strong role in making the Western Hemisphere competitive again with Asia in terms of manufacturing and exports. So for all these reasons, this sort of forgotten region for America is absolutely crucial to understanding its geopolitical future. But what I try and do actually in the chapter is sort of, again, psychoanalyze what's happening in Venezuela. Why does Chavez act the way he does? What is his real ambition within the country? Is it working? Is it not working? And I do the same for Colombia, and I look at Brazil as well. And so that's the third section of the book. The fourth is, how am I doing on time, Steve?
Fine.
Okay. The fourth main section and the longest section is actually about the Middle East, where I traveled basically from Morocco to Iran, although Iran never let me in, and I waited in Iraq for a while on the border, and I realized it was not exactly going to happen, so I moved on. Second time that happened, actually, but it covers this broad region we call the Middle East, though I never call it that. I only use it in quotes because I don't believe the term is useful at all, and I explain that as well. But effectively, to think about the Middle East, we have to break it into its sort of sub-regions. The Maghreb, North African region, the Levant, sort of Near East, what's called the Mashrek, and the Gulf region. And what I do is I treat those in turn, and I look at how European influence in North Africa is growing to such an extent that we need to understand it differently from this broader notion of an Arab Middle East with great troubles with Islam and so on, but rather think of it as an attempt to create, and this is what Sarkozy means when he talks about a Mediterranean Union, a sort of shared relationship across the Mediterranean, such as never has had been so deep today, actually, as it was since the Roman Empire. In fact, we have oil and gas pipelines, every year or two coming on stream that link Tunisia, Libya, Algeria, and so on with southern European countries, and I think that's a physical. It's a physical way of capturing just how deep relations are becoming on an economic level between Europe and North Africa. So it's to be treated as a realm distinct from the Middle East when we think of, say, Iraq or Saudi Arabia and so on. Then I look at the Levant region, I look at Syria as well, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and Europe's growing economic role there and potentially strategic role with its peacekeeping operations, with its attempt to deal with Iran as well, and various ways in which Europe is attempting to take a leadership role. But of course, how China is also coming into the region through its growing relations with Iran and how that impacts the nuclear issue and so forth. And then I focus on the Gulf region. This is a very important case. We think a lot today about America's relationship with Saudi Arabia and how that is a country that was considered an anchor of America's Middle Eastern role, presence, and influence. But if you look beneath the surface, what you find is that, as I mentioned earlier, Europe and China have different diplomatic styles and packages that they offer to these pivotal second world countries from America. And one sees that the share of American investment, this is something I wrote about in the New York Times article as well, has decreased, whereas if you look at Asia's dependence on Saudi Arabian oil and Gulf oil and gas in general, it's far greater than America's is. Their claim to either arbitrate or be part of that energy security picture is as great, if not greater, than America's. And that dynamic and how that plays out and how that affects Saudi decision-making geopolitically, who they buy weapons from, who they trade with, and so forth, is really important to understanding the future of the entire Gulf region. The one thing, there are the two forces that actually permeate this broader Middle East that do cut across those subregions that I discuss are Arabism and Islamism. Arabism, that's been dismissed as a concept because of its sort of negative political connotations from the era of Nasser, has actually made quite a comeback on an economic and cultural level. And I write in the book about how I find that this new Arabism is primarily economic in nature, that the oil-rich countries are investing a great deal more in the non-oil economies than ever before, and that's creating a greater sense of integration among them, despite their political differences. So the new focal point for Arabism isn't the Arab League in Cairo, but it's the city of Dubai, where so much trade is exchanged, a city that has become the Arab melting pot in a way, and the Arab world's truly global city. And I focus a lot on Dubai and its significance and what's happening there. And I also talk obviously about Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and these other means by which the new Arabism is taking shape. The force with which that competes, in a way, is Islamism, which has different manifestations, of course, in every country, but is a common feature across the Arab world. And I pose the question in each country, which is winning out? Is it the new Arabism or is it Islamism in its various forms? And that's a tension that continues to play out. The final section is East Asia, where I look at countries within the India, Japan, Australia triangle. China sits at the center of that, and I call it the Greater Chinese Co-Prosperity Sphere. There's a lot of points to make, actually, about this region, but let me just make a couple. You know, we tend to believe that America's dominance in East Asia is driven by our long-standing military alliances, whether it is with Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Australia, so on, so on. What I have found in the region, in every country, is that they are increasingly focused on not that inside-out geopolitical order that we are familiar with, but rather something that's not the outside-in that was managed by us, but an inside-out order that they are building themselves. The density of institutions in East Asia that are, again, indigenous and formed in their own way. An Asian Monetary Fund is a good example of this. ASEAN, ASEAN Plus 3, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the East Asian Summit or East Asian Community. Some of these groups that don't include the United States at all are the sort of talk of the town, if you will. And that is something that I don't think we appreciate all that much when we look at East Asia. We tend to focus just on how our relations with Japan or our relations with Australia and our deepening relations strategically with India are what will, quote unquote, keep China in check. That provides such a narrow slice of the picture in the region that I almost find it useless, especially when I'm actually traveling in the region. What you find instead is that the degree of trade, or the level of trade amongst East Asian countries is now greater than trade across the Pacific Ocean. The business linkages within the region and the countries within them are a major driver, and in a way just create this cycle of continuous investment and reinvestment across borders that are creating these multiple levels of interaction across politics, economics, business, culture, tourism, and so forth that are leading to a broader sense of what I call Asia for Asians, a certain cultural and economic confidence that is contributed to some extent to this notion that other regions such as Europe and Asia, though not fully there, certainly further than a decade ago, are sort of decoupling from the United States, creating their own regional bloc as much as possible. Again, in a globalized world, no region will necessarily ever be independent from others, but the effort to do so is something that is on the forefront of Asian minds. So that's the final region. The key thing to conclude is on two levels. One, second world countries are very, very strongly divided internally by globalization. The way in which winners and losers are created within them makes them, in a way, highly unpredictable, potentially unstable. No country that I was in can I really say with any confidence exactly where it will be 5 years from now. Whether it will have succeeded, will have made it to the first world, or may it have collapsed for whatever reason into the third world. Very unpredictable countries, but also the countries that I have found are the most strategic. There are countries that are very much in America's, attention or national interest, but that we don't understand well enough on this domestic internal level, and therefore we may not have a good enough understanding of how their foreign policy decisions are made. So that instability is a major factor across the second world. And then there's the issue of diplomacy. Our foreign policy, our grand strategy, and to what extent we are able to balance the power of the European Union and China and our own, and create some kind of equilibrium among them. What can we do diplomatically to create a world of greater burden sharing among these powers, where we are not perceiving ourselves as the sole global policeman and feel that we are the ones running the world, when in fact we are already in a situation where that's not the case. And I delve into a bit this question of how do you create a geopolitical equilibrium and avoid conflict among the superpowers. There isn't necessarily a firm conclusion in that sense, because I think that the dynamic is becoming ever more competitive, and the diplomacy certainly lags behind. But I conclude with some recommendations about what we can do to keep that multipolar world stable. I'll stop right there.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Parag. I'd like to open up the floor, but let me just pose one question. Markets are very much on my mind right now after watching Bear Stearns, which was worth $3.5 billion on Friday, get bought over the weekend for about $260 million. What's important is that big structures can disappear quickly in today's world, and it's made me think about your book somewhat and what you're saying about the United States, Europe, and China to some degree. In markets, kind of like Google stock, it's not what Google is today that justifies its valuation. It's the promise of what it will be tomorrow that, in the eyes of some investors, justifies the high expense for that stock. If you're Bear Stearns, it may not be what it is today. It is what look like tomorrow in terms of being able to compete. And to some degree, I wonder if that's happening with the three nodes of influence that you see competing in the world. When I look at other factors like demographics, it makes me, though I was very impressed with Europe, where I've just come from, in the meeting there, it makes me wonder how, given the rigidities that I see in Europe, particularly on demographics and the ability to absorb migration and other populations, wouldn't that be a diminishing stock? The United States, which looks like it's, in my view, miserable shape today, that its national security portfolio looks very poor, nonetheless on many other areas, particularly the ability to take in migrants, build a population base, etc., looks rather good. And then China, I think everyone agrees, looks like the Google of today, not because of what it can do, but what it looks like it might be tomorrow. So I'm interested in do you really look beyond the moment into this question of what the promise is down the road to evaluate the relative weight and influence of these different zones in second world areas?
Well, each of the three superpowers has enormous internal challenges and liabilities. What you are posing as an advantage for the United States, being an immigrant society, many people obviously, and this is in our headlines every single day, feel that that is weakening America because of the social costs, because of the dilution of identity, and all of these claims that are made about what immigration does to America. The same problem obviously is faced by Europe, but with a different set of migrants. Demographically, though, it's only certain Western European countries that are experiencing population stagnation. Others are growing, but the European Union as a whole represents not a single nation at all. It represents a supranational empire of 27 countries. It has grown. When you talk about trajectory and looking long term, it has grown by one country per year for the last 15 years or so, more or less since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and is still growing. One little country by country, its population is 450 million. When you think about the productive assets that a young population like Ukraine and Turkey are starting to and will bring to Europe, you have a European Commonwealth of close to 600 million people that is in fact dynamic, and it is industrial powerhouse, and is the largest single economic bloc in the world. So I don't worry about demographics in that sense. The internal challenge of managing migration is a problem that they face every bit as much as we do. China, of course, as you say, looks to be the Google of demographics, and what I wanted to point out as a third argument to look at non-military factors in China's rise is, of course, the Chinese diaspora in East Asia, 25 million strong, that play a commanding role in many of the economies in the Pacific Rim, and how that has played a pivotal role in the integration of East Asia around China.
Let me open up the floor. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Coughlin from the Center for American Progress. You haven't mentioned Africa at all. How do you see it in this paradigm?
This is what people like me do. I heard Hillary Clinton give a speech the other day, and she failed to mention Israel-Palestine, so I zapped her for it. So you didn't mention Africa. Why not?
One of the first comments I got from the New York Times essay adapted from this book was, you managed to write an 8,000-word essay about the future of world order and everything, and you didn't mention Israel once. And people were shocked that I managed to pull that off, though it was not at all intentional.
No one will believe that.
The exclusion of Africa from this book actually was intentional. And I didn't clarify, because it's a longer discussion, what I mean by second world in terms of countries that are both first and third world at the same time and exhibit this internal tension, and how these same countries are diplomatically becoming powerful enough and influential enough to shape the balance of power in the world. Very few African countries, if any, actually fit that bill. Some of them are resource rich, Angola, Nigeria, and so forth. But they aren't, to me, they don't merit that kind of complex, sort of study in terms of what the internal decision-making dynamics are. The cover story of the Economist this week is the new colonialists, and it's about China's march into Africa and elsewhere to pursue natural resources. The decision-making that these countries are undergoing is not terribly complicated, sort of sell to the highest bidder, and that's what's going on. And many of these kleptocratic regimes keep as much of that as possible. Yes, there's a lot more than one can say, but I don't believe it's as complicated as the dynamics of, say, a Libya or an Egypt or a Saudi or a Kazakhstan and so on, the countries that I'm saying. But also, again, fundamentally, rather than making arguments against Africa, let me point out that it has a lot to do with which countries have, again, the clout and credibility and diplomatic influence to really tip that balance of power. What an African country does with respect to aligning with China or Europe or America doesn't necessarily impact what a lot of other countries do. But when Saudi Arabia tilts a certain way, everyone notices. When Egypt does, everyone notices. When Kazakhstan does, everyone notices. Venezuela, and so on and so on. So that is the reason why I don't deal with Africa much in this book.
Thank you. Right here, David.
Yeah, Dave Fitzgerald, private consultant. I'd like to go back to those three styles you mentioned, the coalition, consensus, and consultative. Do you see any differences there, or problems with those three nodes of power interacting with each other? Both the consensus and the consultative style seems to be more of a conservative approach to things, and both of those countries are surrounded by other countries, and the United States is off more or less isolated in the world, and looking at the world as how they can form coalitions.
So far,
there's a
So for our own video, I just want to mention that this is touching upon your comments about the styles of really wielding power, consultative consensus building and coalition building.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point, and I address it in the book, as to what extent there's historical and geographical factors that influence and shape why our diplomacy is the way it is, and why Europe's is and China's is, and so on. And of course, it does create tensions and frustrations in how they deal with each other. we believe that we are very quick and efficient, but it leads to a situation where we don't have sort of permanent allies anymore on any given kind of issue. Whereas once Europe binds a country into the EU, what are the chances it's ever going to get out or want to get out? So there's pros and cons to each. We're frustrated by how slow Europe is and how there's 27 capitals. Who do we call for Europe? They're frustrated by our having different policies on each issue, or no one coherent policy. You can talk to people in China, diplomats and analysts who come to Washington. They say, we want Washington's position on us, on China, but they get one answer from DOD, one answer from state, one answer when they go to NSC, one answer at the White House, and so on and so on. So they all have their frustrations with each other, and this is part of what I was trying to get at the end when I said that a greater amount of diplomacy or standing, sort of G3 as I call it, a G3 of the big three, would go some of the way towards creating a structure whereby these diplomatic styles could sort of more fruitfully interact than they do today. But we don't have any such body.
Okay. Yes. Right here.
And I haven't read your book. I'm really looking forward to doing so after your presentation. The little slip of paper that I received with the invitation here raised certain questions in my mind, which you have answered superbly in your presentation. But I'm still left with slight unease because of your three centers that you talk about. You've got two apples and one orange. And an orange with very many segments in any orange that I've ever tasted. The EU, Brussels, doesn't have the cohesion that either the US or China does have. The other countries, you talked about Turkey, you talked about India coming up, etc. But the EU and Brussels is a different cup of tea altogether. And I'm still not sure, how you can put the EU together with the US and China.
Sure.
This,
You're talking
yeah.
about France, you're talking about
Let me
Germany,
repeat it.
You're talking about
Right.
the UK, you're talking about Poland.
Right.
Each of these, or Turkey, which you mentioned.
Right.
One can understand that. If you put them all together and the EU is growing more segments of this orange with umpteen segments in it, I'm not quite sure what cohesion it has anymore.
Let me just for the video, we need to move on. But let me just raise to repeat for the camera here that didn't have the benefit of your eloquent comment, to say that what you've said is you've compared two apples and an orange. The orange being Europe that lacks the cohesiveness of, say, a China or the United States today. How do you deal with that? I'll add a little postscript to this that I think is interesting. In Brussels, there was a BBC World meeting moderated by Nick Gowing that featured Richard Holbrooke, our old friend Radek Sikorski from in town, who's now the Polish foreign minister, Bernard Kouchner, and I think the fourth, Alexander Kutchins, who's chairman of the International Relations Committee on the Duma. And Holbrooke essentially set it up in a brilliant way, saying, we need, partially being part of a discussion of, are the values of the West being attacked by others? And what was very interesting is by the end of the discussion, Holbrooke rolled a bowling ball into it and said, none of you, except myself and Bernard Kouchner, are really wanting to talk about the real issues, Darfur, climate change, et cetera, and you're stuck in petty disputes between Poland and Russia and whatnot. But it does fundamentally, it got right at this issue of the cohesiveness in Brussels, which became one of the dominant themes, frankly, of the entire meeting. So I just thought I'd add that little bit of, rich programmatic relevance to the question.
It's interesting how the European Union has become the greatest success story of international governance without having this cohesion. I think it would be nice to have, but we need to understand Europe on its own terms. It does not need to meet the criteria of cohesive nation-state-ness in order to be treated like a superpower. It is the world's largest common market. It represents a set of standards, environmental, product safety, you name it, that is second to none in the world. It gives collectively the most development assistance. It exports or invests the most capital overseas, and imports the most as well. It is, in all of those dimensions, greater than the United States of America is. I think that point fundamentally needs to be made. It does all of those things without having that single, cohesive, decisive actor within it. The argument I make in the book is that it is this network superpower, as some have termed it. Most things that individual European countries do, even if for themselves, in a way benefit the collective union. So when gas is imported from North Africa and it's a deal that's pursued by a Spanish or Italian energy company, the gas goes into the common European grid and market. It collectively diminishes the dependence that Europe has on Russian oil resources. Of course, there's a long way to go on that issue, but the point is to say the things that individual European countries do often do benefit the Union as a whole. And I think that applies across a wide spectrum of issues. Some are more concerned with migration than others, so there's different kinds of experimentation that goes on in terms of integration of non-European populations, and so on and so on and so on. So I find that the very question reveals sort of our bias in terms of cohesion, rather than just looking at in what areas there's been success and what areas there hasn't. Militarily, of course, that's one area where one would wish that there was more cohesion. The Balkans in the 1990s obviously proved the weakness there. One can only say to that in the last decade or two, there's been a number of steps forward in terms of rectifying that. The attempt to create a rapid reaction force, the number of European-led peacekeeping operations and stabilization missions that are around the region, Africa, the Middle East, Balkans, and so forth. So my answer is that they are getting there, even if they never get to singular unitary cohesion. They are finding ways to address their common problems in a way that is successful. And I think that is what matters more than anything else.
Gary?
Gary Mitchell from the Mitchell Report. I want to ask this question and put it in this framework. 20 years ago, Kenichi Omai, who was then head of McKinsey Japan, wrote a book called Triad Power, a series of articles in the Harvard Business Review, and then his sort of pièce de résistance, the borderless world, in which he essentially said to corporate clients, if you're going to be successful in the next century, you're going to have to operate successfully in three nodes: Japan, the U.S., and Europe. Now, fast forward to today, where I understand you're not writing this from the perspective of corporate clients per se. Still, it's three nodes. In between borderless world and second world, we've had globalization and internet, et cetera. My question that I'm really interested in is, did you begin this, I won't just say the book, but this study, with the belief that these three nodes were the critical ones? Or did you come to that conclusion as a result, if you will, of visiting the second world? I'm interested to know how much was before you began the travels, if you will, and how much came out of those travels?
The question was whether the notion of these three dominant imperial powers, the US, EU, and China, was something that was premeditated, predetermined, and shaped the narrative going in, or whether it was something that I sort of experienced and uncovered along the way. And it's a little bit of both. I mean, I think that, even a few years ago before I began this project, you could read books about how America is and continues to be the single hegemon in the world, and we will have no rivals for a long time. But you could also pick up books a few years ago already saying Europe is the global standard setter, Europe will lead the 21st century, and there are a number of books to that effect written by people right here in Washington. You could also have read a couple of years ago books saying China will run the 21st century, China is the next superpower. How could you have all three of those books in the same world? As far as I'm concerned, it's still just one planet that we all live on. And so to some extent, in advance, I was aware of this sort of, a phenomenon of people predicting Europe, China, and America as the three sort of dominant forces, and that shaped my thinking to some extent. That argument was borne out, which is why it remained part of my thesis and plays a dominant role in structuring and the argumentation of the book. So it's a little bit of both.
Very back, Gareth.
Gareth Porter, independent historian and journalist. I'm interested in your take on the dialectic between the economic power that you obviously discuss throughout the book in various ways, and sort of conventional national security thinking in the United States, which focuses a great deal on military force and its role in U.S. policy. And what interests me is that you have here three world power centers, two of which really do not claim to be global military powers, or are not headed towards sort of the kinds of military involvements the United States seems to take for granted globally. And I'm not clear on whether you either implicitly or explicitly are in fact making a critique of conventional national security thinking in this country or not. The use of the term great game, of course, conjures up the kinds of images of traditionally marching into Afghanistan and those sorts of areas waging military struggles. And then at the end, you talk about the need to avoid struggles or conflicts among the three major powers. But I'm curious to know, whether you intended to make an implicit critique, an explicit critique, or to fit into the existing sort of paradigm of national security thinking.
So again, just for the camera, our camera, the question, just to butcher a quite good question, was again a two apples and orange question, but this time it's flipped, which is you're asking whether Parag Khanna is critiquing the military dimensions of power and how the U.S. compares vis-a-vis China and Europe in those regards.
That we overestimate or have overestimated the potential of military power to achieve foreign policy and diplomatic objectives kind of speaks for itself in the last decade. There's hardly anything more to be said on that subject. So it is a critique of that thinking, and it explicitly so. But more subtly than that, this is a book about diplomacy, and it's about not separating hard power from soft power as if there really is a clear distinction, as if it isn't a spectrum. And it's not about saying there's this economic tool, there's this military tool, there's this cultural tool, there's diplomatic tool, and so on and so on. It's about taking them all together and evaluating what is the nature of relations with a country. So even though Saudi Arabia, as I mentioned earlier, has been a military ally and so forth, our economic leverage has been decreasing. That has diminished our overall leverage in that country. The same thing goes for Turkey, and so on around the world. So there is a very strong message in this book about the importance of making sure that America as a whole, its private sector, through assistance and other strategies, is well integrated and influential in these key second world economies, and the way in which we will lose influence if that is no longer the case, because military leverage or relations alone do not compensate for that.
But you're not arguing that it's counterproductive, that the U.S. focus on the military is counterproductive?
I'm saying that that's just one piece of the puzzle, and in some places it's a large piece, in other places
But what,
it's
just to
small.
draw it out for a minute, but what if that's all that's left? I mean, after having exchanged some dollars for euros, I'm going to Japan soon and not pleased with the prospect of the cost of the train into town. To some degree, it reminds me of Ken Rogoff's piece written in 2004 called The Debtor's Empire. And I asked Deputy Secretary Bob Kimmett about this over the weekend, and I said, doesn't it seem to you that our discussions about the global economy and America's place in it have this sort of weird detachment from the reality that our power is being pounded through two arenas, one, the Pentagon, and then second, our massive debt, and the debt trap, or the dollar trap, which much of the world is in. We're not driving power through our currency reserves or the ability to invest. So to some degree, it raises the fundamental question. If you look at the fact that America has a weird, cynical, sort of inverse relationship to the choices other states make, which means if we fail, they all go down too. It does come into this question on the military side of whether the United States really has fundamentally many other options other than the Pentagon and military, as opposed to just pretending that we even have the ability to make significant contributions on the soft power side of it, which I find to some degree to be more of a pining for a difference than a serious, not to critique you too much, it's kind of like you want us to go there, but when you look at the trends, they don't look like they're going that direction at all.
No, they're not. I do not end on an optimistic note about our ability to fulfill that prescription that I mentioned earlier. I want to point out that about this relationship between military and economic power, I have a line where I say, imperialism was once practiced by conquering countries, now you buy them. And this is a book, to a large extent, about how cash is king, how the imperial forces use money and use economic strings to deepen and tighten those relations with second world countries in a way in which, and because you mentioned that two of these three, China and Europe, versus the United States, do not have global military ambitions, and it plays a less prominent role in the structuring of bilateral relations with second world countries. Money, finance, investment, trade, aid, those play a much bigger role, and they have had enormous success in binding allies and building relationships by those means alone.
Let me take another. I should say, in response, Kimmett gave a fantastic response, which some of you should go back and look, saying our international institutions today, even the financial institutions, are completely inadequate given the realities of financial power in the world. I thought it was one of the most honest, on-the-record comments that somebody had given. It's on the video for the German Marshall Fund site. Yes, in the back.
Thank you. Sanjay Malik from Pillsbury Winthrop. Picking up on that point, however, I would submit that it's ironic to at the same time say the U.S. is burdened with the debt of its imperialism, but now is down sharing the stage with other countries. In a way, there's a global free rider issue that arises from the fact that the U.S. has borne the burden of
Right.
taking care of global order. And people can have different opinions about whether that's been effective or not. But I wonder, therefore, whether the approaches are really core philosophies or whether they are a product of circumstances. The U.S. is the only country that can assert hard power globally. The others, China and the EU, cannot. So from the Google perspective, as China's power increases, do you see it continuing to adhere to its philosophy of respect for sovereignty and economic mutual interest, or will it then turn to assertion of hard power once it can, which it currently cannot?
This is a great question, and I'm going to add John Eikenberry to this because he's one of Parag's friendly critics, asking whether or not there is sort of a social contract between the United States and the rest of the world, where the United States is the Leviathan, and the world essentially extracts benefits from the way in which the United States has organized global security, and so we get away with things, frankly, that others can't because of the contract and the need, and this is how things have sort of evolved, which I think is very, very important way to look at it. And the question of if that is deteriorating, that contract is coming apart, will China's behavior, will the structure of other states begin to take on similar characteristics?
I think there's two questions. One is whether we really are providing the global public good of security in a way that we have claimed to in the past, and whether or not that is even desired by the rest of the world. And the second question is, how will China act as its resources militarily and otherwise increase on the global stage? To the first question, there's clear evidence if you look, for example, at the Straits of Malacca and the way in which America's proposals to patrol and for maritime security and other reasons have been more or less rejected, sidelined, marginalized in favor of Indonesian, Singaporean, and others, and Japanese-funded efforts to have their own Asian-driven and Asian military patrolling the Straits of Malacca. It's an example of how that notion that America is the sole and only provider of freedom of the seas and so forth is not quite as robust as before. In the Indian Ocean, no longer is it necessarily desired or tolerated that we do that, but we need to partner with India to try to have that happen. But there could come a time when China wants to do so in the Arabian Sea as well, through its alliance with Pakistan and by having ships based at the port of Gwadar. That is certainly a scenario that could develop in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So around the world, I think you'll see examples of how that notion that we provide it really is replaced by either it doesn't exist, it isn't desired, or someone else is doing it. So I think we really have to look at that transition very seriously. With respect to China, it's going to depend on a case-by-case kind of basis. The support for the regime in Burma, for example, led to a lot of backlash and critique. And now Chinese diplomats, if you talk to them, they say, "Wow, we're learning very quickly that it can't just be an open checkbook to this regime. We need to focus on changing their governance and so on." The most powerful force really is shame in dealing with this, and wherever there is exposure of this kind of thing, there's a rapid backtracking and attempt to sort of salvage reputation, save face, and play along with the sort of global norms or whatever those are perceived to be. Sudan is another example. So it's really going to depend on the situation, to what extent there is transparency over what is happening militarily versus where it can sort of still get away with it. This is obviously, this should all sound familiar because this is our own experience of global military relations into Germany over the last century, and I think that they will probably learn a lot faster in a way because of the amount of transparency and attention and spotlight that they receive for everything they do. Wherever there's a single Chinese peacekeeper, whether it's Haiti or potentially in Afghanistan, in the next years there's a lot of scrutiny as to what they do. So I think their behavior will be modified fairly quickly.
I see Nick Lardy here from the Peterson Institute for National Economics. I won't call him unless he wants to be called, but one of the things I do want to raise about Nick's work is he's taught me in his writing to be wary of those who sort of straight line, as I suggested earlier, China's success, that there are all sorts of internal fragilities, political fragilities, and particularly economic fragilities. Do you get into that at all? I mean, when I was last in China, I saw both sides of it. I saw arrogance from some of its financial elite that reminded me of early 1990s Japanese financial elites. But I also saw lots of Chinese bureaucrats that almost seem afraid of success. The questions and challenges that they had there. And is that a fair characterization, Nick? You talk a lot about these internal speed bumps and pivot points, and wondering to what degree you got a sense of that in China.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm far from sort of Panglossian about the eternal longevity of European power and its path to global influence, and the same for China versus for us. I'm very critical of all three systems in various ways. I do believe that those will remain the dominant systems. I spent a lot of time in China. I drove across most of the country and saw a lot of it. And the thing that struck me was two things. One, no one can really claim with certainty that the China model, that China, the Chinese empire, and say, will succeed. It's every day in China is a new experiment, an unprecedented one in human history, to govern and make prosperous 1.5 billion people. There isn't a rule book for it that comes from the outside. It's clearly an experiment that is coming from within. And the extent to which China's leadership, whether it's political, economic, or otherwise, is juggling all these balls in the air is very apparent from everything that one speaks to there. The enormous environmental stress, social liabilities, political pressures for government transformation, management of all of these problems is obviously foremost on their minds, and it's impossible to deny that there are scenarios whereby the whole thing just falls apart, or there's a sort of domino effect internally by which the situation kind of crumbles and really slows their path towards the kind of global power and influence role that I'm describing. So I absolutely got a sense of it, but I will say this, in no country was I more impressed with the efforts that are being made and the plans that are being crafted to deal with these issues. Even in more transparent democratic societies like India, which have a similar, obviously, demographic size, not in India does one see anywhere nearly approximating the effort and plans towards trying to feed people, provide education, provide health care, a pension system, deal with the environmental issues, try and clean that up, and so on, and manage internal stresses, whether they are environmental, social, and the like. And that is what impressed me the most there. That still does not mean that it's going to succeed. But there really wasn't a question I could throw at them for which I didn't get some sort of semi-adequate answer, which is more than I can say for a lot of other countries that I've been in.
Interesting. Thanks. Susan Kinsley.
Susan Kinsley.
I'm going to hold this next to you so I don't have to repeat the question.
Susan Kinsley, consultant. Where does Russia fit into your matrix? I mean, as far as I can tell, they're a second world country. They're not particularly...
Not an attitude.
Huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Not an attitude.
Right. Okay.
It's a great question. It's Russia is the country from which I'm getting the most hate mail these days.
And are they going to let you in?
Well, I was invited. I'm going to hold off for a while. But Russia is so big, I had to split it into 4 parts and deal with it in 2 separate sections of my book. And I argue in the New York Times piece and in the book that one has to wonder whether it really makes sense as a country. In attitude, it's thinks it's a superpower, but its economy is about the size, I think, of Korea's or something like that. So there's a limit to which it can play sort of global hardball, geopolitically on a sustainable basis, especially given a single commodity dependence, which is obviously historically and across geographies a recipe for long-term instability, corruption, mismanagement, and so on. So I deal with it again in two different geographic zones. That for me, I deal with in the European zone, in which I talk about sort of Slavic Russia, Gazprom, relations with Europe, growing integration with Europe, the desire for respect, the questions about NATO expansion, relations with the EU, and so on. But then the Asian zone, which contains obviously a vast amount of natural resources, but is increasingly a demographic void being filled, and I don't want to overstate the case, but in particular areas by ethnic Chinese, Koreans, and others who increasingly sort of manage that actual space, purchase and consume the resources and ship those to China. Now, Russia is playing relatively smart diplomacy to an extent. It has a strategic alliance with China through the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. They do joint military exercises, but it is also very weary of the fact that it no longer has a demographic presence in a lot of its own country. That is a problem. The map of the world is always changing, and I vote for Russia as the country in the next 10, 15 years beyond to have its map changed negatively. Remember, that already happened almost 20 years ago, very unfavorably for Russia. That's a process that, by strict demographics and other logics, is likely to continue. Every 5 years you could have maps on the wall and show how the world looks different. Don't count on Russia being Russia any more than you would count on another place staying intact. So that's a partial answer to your question, but there's a lot of ink on Russia in this book. So,
I want to just, again, I'm editorializing a lot, but this Brussels forum, which I've mentioned a few times, which I really did love, but the one thing that was there is every meeting was dominated to some degree by the question of Russia, and the Russian and Eastern European participation brought this in. I mean, it just emanated through the whole conference. And there were supposed to be 11 House members and 4 senators at this conference. All but one couldn't make it because of the FISA bill. The senators, however, did get on a plane, and I think it was just a hired plane. Or maybe a military one, but it stopped in Newfoundland to refuel, and then you're nodding, so you know this story, right? And they couldn't restart the plane, and so they sat there in Newfoundland for 4, 5, 6 hours and decided just to fly back to D.C. Now, the importance of that is not to overplay it, but for the Russians, who themselves were used to sort of the jokes behind the back about Russian systems not working, people not getting them there. This looked as if the great American power couldn't really move its senators, couldn't generate its presence at the Brussels Forum, and the Russians were enjoying every moment of it. So no journalist has written about it that way, but that is the way in which the Russians perceived the American absence at this meeting.
And yet they probably weren't missed, which is part of
I wasn't going to say that. Yes, right here. It's Victor, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Victor Bassett, consultant in national security policy. Your talk was very interesting. One problem I have with it, it's basically horizontal and hard power oriented. There's no vertical dimension in it. And this is something that Steve pointed out. What about the future? And we have developments in soft power which are growing and growing. Human rights, they didn't exist a century ago. Now we have human rights, and this gives a leverage of power and leverage of influence in the world. Take a look at morality. Henry VIII had 6 wives. He executed 2 of them, and nothing happened. He stayed in his job. Now the poor New York governor only had 1 prostitute, and he lost his job. So the morality is gaining in significance. Also, slavery existed before, not now. So really, the future is a combination of hard power and soft power, and how effectively each region combines them and leads the world in that regard.
Sure.
So, in your view, which of these 3 regions can be most successful in this kind of combination of soft power and hard power so as to influence the world and lead it in the right direction?
Now I've seen everything. Thank you, Victor, for the video. I would say that the question touches on the subject of soft power and hard power, but wove in Elliot Spitzer, which was a real trick. But thank you.
It's actually, the question you're asking is really the question of sort of global governance. What are the leading norms in the world, and how have they evolved, and who is responsible for upholding them today? I do deal with this a lot in the book, and I allude to it a bit in the case of China earlier, with the question about how will they exercise their military power in the future, given how much scrutiny is on them. What I say in the book, just to really quickly summarize, is that the future of global governance can't just be America's norms and America's values, because already we see in other parts of the world those don't hold, such as within China, which is no small example. We also have the European Union out promoting its own norms, its own systems, its own values, its own parliamentary form of democracy rather than American presidential style democracy. Even when we talk about human rights and democracy, we have two different versions of those narratives being projected and around the world by the EU and the United States. So it's important to keep in mind that there isn't just one standard that you're even talking about in your question. There's multiple ones. What I see is the need for some kind of common denominator and some kind of dialogue among these most influential powers as to what it is going to be that they will sort of subscribe to. If it no longer is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has come under a lot of criticism from Asian nations and others who don't feel that they were sufficiently involved in its drafting, and the whole question of whether or not democracy comes before economic growth or vice versa, to what extent it is something that is required for countries, and this is the debate about whether or not we should create a democracy caucus or council as a competitor to or within the UN General Assembly, and how legitimate that will be. These are the kinds of debates that are what make it important to have a discussion among the key power centers, China, Europe, America, and others, as to what we even mean when we believe that there is a common set of norms or standards in the world, because I don't believe those exist anymore.
Because I know Parag wants to sign some books, folks. I'm going to cluster these last questions, so please help me make them brief, and please make your response brief, but in the very back. Cluster. Yes.
Could you comment on alternative energy? Do these countries really get it, respect from the government and or the business people that matter? Thank you.
So questions on alternative energy? Yes, sir.
Thank you. From the Brazilian Embassy. Your vision is very compelling, but it seems to me that it's also tremendously at odds with the consensus of the foreign policy establishment here in Washington. All we hear about, except from Steve Clement, of course, is to talk about U.S. leadership, U.S. primacy.
I guarantee you that the consensus will eventually look just like what I'm saying today.
How do you see your ideas penetrating or not penetrating into the presidential campaigns?
So, great question. Question is, on Parag's point, is it seems to be very at odds with the Washington consensus here in D.C. How do you penetrate the consciousness of this place other than through New York Times Magazine cover stories? Yes, sir.
Michael Hudson from Georgetown University. We did a program in Dubai last month about strategic issues in the Gulf and so forth, and I raised the question whether declining American hegemony and the sort of vast evaporation of soft power for well-known reasons throughout the Arab world and the Islamic world wasn't posing a strategic problem for these guys. A lot of people agreed with that, but I was taken to task by somebody who said, you don't understand. America's got a blue water navy, America's got and will keep a strong military presence in every little place in this Gulf, and because we are threatened, we in Dubai are threatened by Iran from one side and from sort of Takfiri Salafist Islamism from another side, America is always going to be there. I'm curious about your reaction.
So the answer is Gulf reactions to the decline of American hegemony. And let me take these last two, okay? Yes, sir?
Okay. Given Russia's military capability and Putin's aggressiveness, which country will become a bigger strategic threat to the U.S., China, or Russia?
Which will be the bigger threat to the United States, China, Russia? In the very back. Yes, ma'am.
Marcia Wiss, Hogan and Hartson. Question about the importance of Tibet for China in terms of its continued cohesiveness, particularly in light of what we were just saying about Russia, the loss of the Warsaw Pact, and what might happen in the future with the Russian.
Right. Current news, what does Tibet mean with regard to China and Russia and so on. So we'll finish there, and Parag, your closing comments before we all go rush to spend some time with you and our friend from Politics and Prose with the book.
Great. I won't be able to answer all these, but on alternative energy, Very important topic. Some people have come to me and said, did you intend to write a book about energy security? And no, I didn't, but that is obviously a dominant issue today, and so it came up in discussions everywhere I was. There isn't a global answer to that. There is an effort, though, you find on a sub-regional basis. You see Japan, Korea, and China even cooperating in ways people wouldn't expect in how to stockpile energy reserves, and learning from the Japanese model of doing so in a way to at least maintain some amount of energy independence. There's obviously a lot of investment into alternative energy going on in China and elsewhere. So there's different strategies around the world and how to deal with that. The Dubai question is fascinating. I think that there should be, and maybe there is, but it could be bigger, a whole literature on vulnerable populations, and say that probably this is happening in the Pentagon, which is why they're so good at it. How to identify, vulnerable small places that would welcome military power, and how to continue to exploit those opportunities around the world. And obviously the Gulf statelets, Bahrain, Qatar, which have equal anxiety about Saudi Arabia and Iran, Dubai potentially, which is of course, or the Emirates that has welcomed France in, the Kurds, Mongolia, and others are examples around the world where there is always a toehold, so to speak, for the United States. Kyrgyzstan, at least for now, is another example. So I think that this is a fruitful area of research for people who are looking at American military grand strategy and to what extent how America manages to maintain that military presence where it's needed, and then use that for its own interests, not only nominally to protect those inviting it, but also, of course, to pursue American strategic interests, potentially vis-a-vis Iran and others. But it's a great question and a fascinating area. The Russia question was what exactly?
Which one is the bigger threat?
Russia or China, which is a bigger threat?
That's a great long-term question. I mentioned earlier that they have this strategic alliance, but I don't think it will last very long. I think it will be a situation similar to the late 1960s, where, of course, you had the Sino-Soviet split, and I think that we will probably have another such split again, given the extent to which China really is using Russia as much as possible, but in a very friendly way. And that will be the point at which we will realize that Russia is very much going to have to choose between its sort of Eurasianist identity and potentially just a European one, given its true demographics and economics. So I don't believe that either necessarily needs to be a greater threat to the United States. That always depends on where and what and so on. But I believe that relationship will be the one that will show us where Russia's future truly lies. And the Tibet issue, I mentioned that it's kind of something that's been evolving for decades, China's influence and control over the region. There was a time in the 90s when people would say, there's always the risk that China is going to splinter and that Tibetans and Uyghurs may go their own way. That's really not going to happen, as much as I have a great deal of sympathy for those people, having spent a lot of time in those provinces of China. But it is, as I say in the book, it's like America without anything west of the Rocky Mountains to them. It would require an alien invasion to remove Tibet and Xinjiang from Chinese control. It is an embarrassment to them, but you don't see anyone actually doing anything right now about it. The U.S. and European Union have urged restraint. That's what they do with Israel and Palestine. You don't see them doing a great deal, and they can do far less for Tibet and in Tibet than they can in Israel and Palestine. One last final point about that is India, which is the place where the Tibetan exile leadership has been for decades, and a country that portrays itself as a democratic, liberal alternative to China as a potential influential diplomatic power in the world. But India is very much playing that Asian game of restraint, of respect for sovereignty, non-intervention, cracking down on Tibetan protesters, and so forth. China has, as it has done with Taiwan, attempted diplomatically to isolate resistance to its rule as much as possible. And Tibet, in a way, despite what's happened this week, again, sadly, is kind of an example of that success that China has had in as much as possible suppressing and isolating this kind of situation from happening. And I don't see that dynamic changing, because this is 50 years of Chinese manifest destiny at work here.
Before we close, let me just answer this gentleman's question from the Brazilian embassy, because I think it's very, very important about how you change the view of things. If you look at what's happened in a lot of Washington about the incrementalism of thought, there's a term. I have a very good friend from Japan here, and he'll laugh at this, but there's a term in Japan called Nihon Jinron, this theory of Japanese uniqueness in all things, a sort of a prism through which you look at all things. There's a kind of an America Jinron, which is the theory of American uniqueness, of being extraordinary and different and ability. And we have a very hard time looking at ourselves without looking at it in a way. We have a hard time looking at Ahmadinejad without, presidentializing him in a Bush-like sense. There's an enormous tendency of this town to do that. And I think one of the really interesting things about Parag Khanna's book is, though it's written by an American looking at us, it's to some degree also written about us and our sense of power and the competition of future from the perspectives of a lot of others. Now, how will this happen and perhaps become more of the shade of view that from others here? I think to some degree it's the failure of the times. I mean, I think when you look at markets, you look at American influence, you look at the perception that American power and the mystique of American power has been shorn off by showing key limits in the world, particularly in Iraq. It makes those who be continually incrementalist really wonder about the good sense of that. And I think then you look for the best alternatives that are out there. Here's one that Parag Khanna has done. I think there are others as well that are struggling with how do you retell the story? What kind of narrative can you put on the table to look at the power relationships? And what are the opportunities and problems in that for the United States? So I just wanted to add that. And just in my last comment to promote one of my own guys, on the Russia-China question, I don't necessarily agree with Parag on the split issue, but Flint Leverett, one of our senior fellows here, has written quite compellingly about an axis of interest between Russia and China that really depends upon whether the United States moves in some stupid ways or some smart ways. But to some degree, there may be opportunities of synergies there that may be problematic. So let me thank Parag Khanna for an outstanding forum. I want to thank C-SPAN Book TV for being with us, and thank all of you for joining us. We'll see you next time. Thank you.